Hey there. I don't know if you caught my last video where I was talking about passing the DOT physical. I described my experience, what it was like passing the physical, and then of course after passing the physical having some actual health problems and how that affected my job as a driver. Today I want to talk about some of the questions they're going to ask you when you take the US Department of Transportation physical. There's going to be some questions that come up, and this is all reliant on what answers you give. So of course you can give whatever answer you want to give, but for the most part I talked briefly about how if you have any sort of hearing or vision problems, you will probably be automatically disqualified. Now, when I say vision problems, if you happen to wear glasses like I do, you can still pass the physical as long as you can pass the eye test wearing your glasses, and then they're going to mark on your medical card that you are required to wear your glasses when driving. I, of course, sometimes either wear glasses or contacts, depending on my situation. Same thing goes with if you have a hearing problem. If you happen to wear a hearing aid, that's not going to disqualify you as long as you can wear the hearing aid and pass the hearing portion of the test. Then they'll probably mark in your medical card that you can only drive when wearing your hearing aid. Some of the other vision issues they're going to test for is if you're colorblind, if you can differentiate between blue and green and the different colors on the spectrum. So let me go over some of the other questions, because first topic I would like to cover is high blood pressure, which you probably remember me talking about in a previous video that I have high blood pressure, so I would probably fail the DOT physical if I were to take it today. Now, there are different levels of blood pressure, meaning there's, what's considered normal blood pressure, then there's slightly elevated blood pressure, and then of course there's like off the charts blood pressure. Let's say you fall into that slightly elevated, that won't necessarily automatically disqualify you, but you may have it where you're only temporarily qualified, meaning you're going to have to retest again in about 3 to 6 months, depending on what they mark on your physical. That way, in 3 to 6 months, they'll check again to see if your blood pressure is not off the charts, as I said before. It's always a good idea to try to do all you can to lower your blood pressure. So let me go ahead and talk about some of the other issues, because of course they're going to ask if you have diabetes. But what if you say you don't have it, you didn't even know you have it, and then they give you a test and it turns out you have it? Diabetes is a factor that will disqualify you for the physical. So you're probably thinking, but isn't there like a lot of people in America who have diabetes? So yes, before I get too long-winded into that topic, there are situations where you could potentially be still approved to drive. This will depend on a couple of different factors, such as if you have an insulin pump, a continuous glucose monitor, and other ways that you are controlling your diabetes that can be tracked and reported to your doctor and or employer. I would definitely like to talk more about that in a different video, because of course I talked previously what it's like, how you have to kind of report all of your medical issues to your employer. So even though those seem to be private issues that you probably would not want to tell your employer about, but when you are a driver, they pretty much require you to report a lot of this information to your employer. So if you had one of these continuous glucose monitors, sometimes called a CGM, it's like something that you maybe put on your arm and it tracks your blood glucose, and it usually tracks it through some sort of app, maybe on your phone, that somehow you would have to give permission to your employer to also be tracking your blood glucose. Yes, I know, like I said, this is all something that seems strange that you would have to tell your boss what your blood glucose is, but there are situations where that way they need to check and see that 24/7, they're checking on you, that if for some reason that you are in a state that makes you unsafe to drive, they are going to remove you from your driving position. Okay, so like I said, I can do a whole video on that topic, but let's get to the actual physical. Like when you go in, these are the questions that they're going to ask you, and I'm actually going to read from a paper here so I make sure I don't miss anything. Now, some of these might seem obvious, some of these might seem like, why are they asking that? So, okay, so they're going to ask if you've ever had any sort of head or brain injury, if you have a history of seizures. We already talked about eye problems, hearing problems. They're going to ask if you have heart disease, if you've ever suffered from a heart attack, or if you've had any sort of heart surgery. Now, before I get too much further into the rest of these questions, like for instance, they'll ask if you've ever had cancer. Doesn't mean you're automatically disqualified if you answered yes, but this just means they're going to follow up with more questions depending on what your answer is. Okay, so they'll ask if you have any sort of pacemaker or an implant device, if you've ever had high blood pressure, high cholesterol, and if you have any sort of chronic breathing problems. Okay, so like I said, I have asthma. I have, since I was a child, had chronic bronchitis. So some of these questions, this may affect me. Like it says, have you ever had lung disease? So if you have COPD or anything like that, I'm not going to say you're automatically disqualified, but I am going to say that there's probably going to be a lot of follow-up questions and tests that's going to determine if you can be qualified to drive. Okay, so if you have kidney problems, kidney stones, if you have any sort of stomach, liver, or digestive problems, we talked about diabetes. If you have a history of fainting or passing out, there's a whole category here that kind of falls into brain, head, and mental. So I'll get to that in just a moment. But if you have ever had a stroke, any sort of paralysis, if you have missing or limited use of any of your limbs, this is where I said that you will not be automatically disqualified if you happen to be missing, maybe you've had a hand injury or you're missing a few fingers or something like that. But what's going to happen is they're going to give you an additional test to make sure you can still do the job even though you have missing or limited use of a limb. Okay, they're going to ask you if you have any sort of neck or back problems, if you've ever had a blood clot, if you have any sort of sleep disorders. This is where I said sleep apnea, snoring, that sort of thing they're going to ask you about. If you've ever had a broken bone, I mean, maybe you had a broken bone when you were 8 years old and it's probably healed and doing great ever since then. But these are just questions they're going to ask. It's all going to depend on what you answer. I mean, you could obviously tell them, no, you've never had a broken bone. I mean, how will they know? Are they going to do an x-ray on your body? No, they're not. But, it's up to you how honest you want to be on these tests. Then they're going to ask you if you use tobacco, if you use alcohol, and of course, just because certain substances are legal, like where I live here in Washington, if you use any of those substances, you are probably going to be disqualified. Even though they're totally legal to use those substances, they will probably disqualify you. Let's see. Let's get back into the thing that I referred to as head, brain, and mental, because they describe it as mental problems, but I feel a little weird calling it that, even though that's what they describe it here on the medical papers. So they're wanting to know, of course, like I said, if you have any sort of head trauma, like if you've had any sort of brain injury, but they also consider that if you have dizziness, memory loss, even if you have chronic headaches, they will consider that somehow to fall under the mental disability category. I would not call it that, but that's what they call it. And of course, if for some reason you have anxiety, depression, or any other psychiatric situation where maybe you're taking medication for that, you may be disqualified and you may not get hired for a job. Even though, of course, we say here in America, it's important to get help if you have these issues, yet somehow you can basically lose a job if you try to get help for your issues. So here I am just adding my personal commentary. I'm trying to stick with the facts here, but I'm just, of course, it's hard to not have some personal feelings about some of these questions here. Okay, so let me go into, like I'd mentioned, I don't mean to spend too much time mentioning the high blood pressure because that's a main one, the diabetes, that's a main one, and of course hearing and vision. Okay, let me get down to the nitty-gritty here to just double check that we didn't skip anything. Another thing that falls into that mental category is chronic pain. Now, I'm sure there's lots of reasons people have chronic pain or fatigue. Probably everyone I know has fatigue. Okay, but they're talking about if this is something that is going to affect your job in some way, or if you're taking any sort of medication for these issues, especially when I talked about if you happen to be someone who snores. I snore, okay, but am I going to tell, the medical examiner I snore? I mean, obviously you're supposed to be truthful and honest, but does telling them say that I snore, am I going to be disqualified for this physical? Okay, let me just recap what we went over. So far, I went over the questions they're going to ask you on the physical, but then there's actually what the doctor is going to do on their own, not based on the questions. And a lot of that is going to be, they're going to look at your eyes, your ears, they're going to look inside your ear with a scope, they're probably going to look at your mouth, your throat, they're going to check your heart. They're going to check to see if you have any sort of hernias, because this could make it hard to like stretch and reach and move and be physically fit if you have a hernia, especially one that's causing a lot of pain. They're going to, in general, just listen to how you talk when they ask you questions, kind of see, your speech, see if you seem to be alert. They're going to ask you to just kind of like walk around, and they'll see if you have a limp or anything like that. When I said they check your heart, they'll check your lungs, they'll listen to your heart and listen to your breathing. They will ask if you have arthritis. Now I'm going to talk again about the mental disorders category. Okay, so like I mentioned, that this is anything having to do with your memory, your reasoning, your attention, and your judgment. If you have emotional instability, it does mention if you are nervous, if you have a personality disorder, if you deal with paranoia, any sort of functional disorders that could cause drowsiness, dizziness, confusion, weakness, uncoordination, inattention. There is also sometimes the test where they'll shine a light in your eye to see how your eyes react, or they tap your knee to see if you have reflex movements. Now, this particular paperwork I'm reading from one of these medical tests says instructions for performing and recording medical examinations. It does say that they will check your general appearance. They will make note of anyone that is particularly overweight, if you have any posture defects, a limp, any sort of tremor. And there are some times when they may ask you to lift an object or a slightly heavy object just to see if you're capable of being able to bend down, pick something up, and lift something over your head. Now, a lot of these tests, maybe they vary by state. I am in the United States, so I would really be interested in what these tests would be like if they have any sort of testing. If you happen to be in Canada, am I a driver over in Europe? I'm really curious if they do any sort of test like this, what the requirements are. Feel free to leave your feedback because it's very interesting to me. Like I said, I'm in America, so I'm just going over these medical examiner questions for when you're passing your DOT physical, the U.S. Department of Transportation physical that's required to be a truck driver, a school bus driver, or any sort of driver where you're responsible for other people's safety. I hope you enjoyed this video. I may put out a few more videos covering this topic because there's kind of a lot to talk about, especially when I talk about my own personal experience. But I definitely want to thank you for watching today.